Hi, this is the video for the audio and kind of explanation of what is the horror genre, a literary criticism by Sharon A. Russell. Sharon A. Russell is a retired professor of communication and women's studies at Indiana State University, where she taught courses on film and television. Russell has published extensively on horror film and literature and detective fiction. She's the author of Stephen King, A Critical Companion, a book that analyzes several of King's famous horror novels in which this essay appears. So, this whole essay is just going to focus around this question. So, what is the genre of horror? And then we'll just keep talking as we go through.
What is the horror genre? Literary criticism by Sharon A. Russell. Many people define horror by its subjects. We all think of creatures like Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman as monsters in the horror genre. Each one of these creatures has a history and developed over a period of time. But we also know that horror covers more than just these monsters. We could all make long lists of the kind of creatures we identify with horror, especially when we think of films as well as literature. The minute we would start to make such a list, we would also realize that not all monsters are alike, and that not all horror deals with monsters. The subject approach is not the clearest way to define this genre.
All right, so this paragraph starts out with many people define horror by its subjects. So we can tell right away that she's going to discuss how people define horror and how she thinks the right way to define horror is. So, how exactly do you know a story is a horror story? She ends this paragraph by, so most of it is talking about monsters. So she's saying not all monsters are alike and not all horror deals with monsters. So categorizing the subject, so the subject being monsters, we can't say that all horror stories have monsters because they don't. So she's just going to keep looking for ways that we can identify the horror genre. How do we know that a story is a horror story?
Some students of this genre find that the best way to examine it is to deal with the way horror fiction is organized or structured. Examining the organization of a horror story shows that it shares certain traits with other types of fiction. Horror stories share the use of suspense as a tactic with many other kinds of literature. The tension we feel when a character goes into the attic, down into the basement, or just into the abandoned house is partially a result of suspense. We don't know what is going to happen, but that suspense is intensified by our knowledge of the genre. We know that characters involved in the world of horror always meet something awful when they go where they shouldn't. Part of the tension is created because they are doing something we know is going to get them in trouble. Stephen King refers directly to our anticipation of horror. In Salem's Lot, Susan approaches the house which is the source of evil. She found herself thinking of those drive-in horror movie epics where the heroine goes venturing up the narrow attic stairs or down into some dark, cobwebby cellar, and she, thinking, I'd never do that. Of course, Susan's fears are justified. She does end up dead in the basement, a victim of the vampire.
All right, so second paragraph, she's talking about organization of stories, so how they're organized and set up, and kind of getting into suspense.
If the horror genre uses the character's search for information to create suspense, it controls when and where we get our knowledge. Because we are outside of the situation, we usually know more than the characters. Our advanced knowledge creates suspense because we can anticipate what is going to happen. The author can play with those expectations by either confirming them or surprising us with a different outcome. When suspense is an important element in fiction, we may often find that the plot is the most critical part of the story. We care more about what happens next than about who the characters are or where the story is set. But setting is often considered a part of the horror genre. If the genre has traditional monsters, it also has traditional settings. Only authors who want to challenge the tradition place events in bright, beautiful parks. We expect a connection between the setting and the events in this genre. We are not surprised to find old houses, abandoned castles, damp cellars, or dark forests as important elements in the horror story.
All right, so this paragraph, she brings up two other ways that we might be able to identify horror. The first is the plot, so just what happens and that building of the suspense as we read a story. And then the other one is setting. So far we have organization of the story, suspense, plot, and setting as different ways that we can figure out if a story is a horror story.
Some people make further distinctions based on how the stories are organized. We can divide stories into different categories based on how we come to believe in the events related and how they are explained to us. Stories that deal with parallel worlds expect us to accept those worlds without question. We just believe Dorothy is in Oz. We accept Oz as a parallel world separate from ours. Other times, events seem to be supernatural, but turn out to have natural explanations. The ghosts turn out to be squirrels in the attic, or things that move mysteriously are part of a plot to drive someone crazy. Sometimes the supernatural is the result of the way the central character sees the world, as in stories told from the point of view of a crazy person. But at times we are not sure and hesitate about believing in the possibility of the supernatural. When I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows because I believed that vampires could exist. This type of hesitation, when we almost believe, falls into the general category of the fantastic. Often, horror has its greatest effect on us because we almost believe, or believe while we are reading the book or watching the film, that the events are possible.
All right, so with this paragraph, we're still talking about the organization of the story and even more specifically how the world is built. So, how a parallel world is built, how supernatural is built in. So, when we read a story like that, we just believe what we're told and kind of go along with that story. So, it's the world building within, or how the worlds in the story are structured. Then, last page.
Yet another way of categorizing works of horror is by the source of the horror. Some horror comes from inside the characters. Something goes wrong inside, and a person turns into a monster. Dr. Frankenstein's need for knowledge turns him into the kind of person who creates a monster. Dr. Jekyll also values his desire for information above all else and creates Mr. Hyde. In another kind of horror story, the threat to the central character or characters comes from outside. An outside force may invade the character and then force the evil out again. The vampire attacks the victim, but then the victim becomes a vampire and attacks others. Stories of ghosts or demonic possession also fall into this category. We can also look.
All right, one of the last ways is the source of the horror. So, is it coming from inside a character? So, somebody turning into a monster or someone just being a monster on their inside? Or coming from outside? So, facing a villain or fighting something evil. That would be outside of the main character source. And then, last one.
Look at the kinds of themes common to horror. Many works concentrate on the conflict between good and evil. Works about the fantastic may deal with the search for forbidden knowledge that appears in much horror literature. Such quests are used as a way of examining our attitude toward knowledge. While society may believe that new knowledge is always good, the horror genre may question this assumption, examining how such advances affect the individual and society.
All right, so the last one they discuss is themes. So just exploring good versus evil. Most themes are just used as a way of examining our attitude towards knowledge. So we're just trying to understand our own world by reading those horror stories. And that is it for this text. So head back to your slideshow and go ahead and start working on your paragraph for this text. And that is it.